"2,500 years ago, Western civilization was threatened with extinction. An invader from the east, the Persian Empire, came with a huge army to enslave the independent cities of Greece. In the face of overwhelming odds, Sparta and Athens led the resistance. In the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Gates of Fire, 300 hoplite warriors from Sparta made a heroic last stand, sacrificing themselves to delay the enemy and set an example to the rest of Greece. Within days, the Athenian navy took on the might of the Persians. They delivered a crushing blow to their fleet just a few miles from the heart of Athens, here in the Bay of Salamis. In the war against the Persians, Sparta and Athens had fought as allies, but these were two very different places. Athens, a fledgling democracy, could boast of being the commercial and cultural centre of Greece, an outward-looking civilized society where power supposedly lay with the demos, the people. Sparta was a militaristic state, ruled by a warrior elite and propped up by a population of slaves. Its boys, if they survived a state program of infanticide, were taken from the arms of their mothers at the age of 7 to be indoctrinated with the Spartan code of death or glory. They lived mainly apart from their women, who were a phenomenon in their own right. Smart, independent, and physically outstanding. These radically opposing systems were so incompatible that with no common enemy to distract them, cooperation between the two most powerful city-states in Greece would eventually give way to fear and paranoia. And the one-time allies would be driven to take up arms again, this time against each other. And so the stage was set for an epic struggle. Sparta versus Athens, the warrior elite versus the demos. The result of that conflict would decide the fate of Greece. For Sparta and Athens, the experience of the Persian invasion had been very different. Hundreds of miles from the front line, in the idyllic countryside of Laconia, the Spartan homeland had been untouched by the war. Whilst the warrior elite were away fighting, for the women, children and slaves of Sparta, life continued as normal, protected by the Taygetus Mountains and sustained by the fields of the Eurotas Valley, one of the most fertile regions of Greece. Athens didn't fare as well. The city had been occupied by the Persians and its citizens forced to flee. The treasurers and priests who'd barricaded themselves in on the Acropolis to guard the belongings of the gods had been unable to prevent the destruction of this, the city's most sacred place. Here in Sparta, in the rugged, enclosed peninsula of the Peloponnese, the war had seemed a distant affair. With peace restored, the Spartans quickly returned to their usual routines, the pursuit of physical and military perfection. This society was disciplined, obedient, and above all, willing to sacrifice the needs of the family and of the individual for the good of the state, if necessary, to die for the cause. The cause was simple: protection of the utopia the Spartans thought they'd created. To do that, they needed to produce more of their famed hoplite warriors. But beyond that, the Spartans had few other ambitions. All they wanted was to maintain the status quo. But in post-war Athens, things were changing fast. The trauma of occupation, followed by the euphoria of victory, was transforming the city. Before the war, the foundations of democracy had been laid, but it was democracy in name only. In reality, it was men with money who had the say. Now, a massive power shift was taking place. Welcome to the cradle of democracy, an Athenian trireme. Powered by nearly 200 oarsmen, it was sea-borne battering rams like this that had annihilated the Persian fleet at Salamis. At the hour of crisis for Greece, it was the poor of Athens who'd squeezed down onto these cramped rowing benches and sent the triremes smashing into the hulls of their enemies. These were the have-nots of the city, the bottom of the political pecking order. But after Salamis, all that changed. The oarsmen who'd endured the sweat and the stench and the terror of being down here had won a historic victory, and now they wanted to have their say. Athenian democracy was galvanized. The champion of the Athenian oarsmen was Pericles. He was a wealthy aristocrat, exactly the sort who'd run the so-called democracy in Athens for generations. He was also shrewd enough to sense that things had changed, and ambitious enough to put himself at the head of that change. Pericles could see that in order to secure power, he needed to distance himself from the nobles, play to the gallery, ingratiate himself with the people. He was a formidable orator, and his powers of argument and speech won them over. But it wasn't just what Pericles said that impressed the citizens of Athens. He designed a mass civic building program that, in effect, would be a job creation scheme for the city's poor.
All kinds of enterprises and demands will be created, which will provide inspiration for every art, find employment for every hand, and transform the whole people into wage earners, so that the city will decorate and maintain herself at the same time.
True to his word, Pericles opened the coffers of Athens to pay for public festivals and grandiose monuments like the Parthenon. But most significantly of all, he introduced state salaries for juries and war service. Now the oarsmen could trade in their rowing benches for seats of power in the city. For the first time in Athens, democracy was really coming to mean government by the people. And this is where its voice could be heard, the Athenian Agora. If the Acropolis was the soul of Athens, then the Agora was its beating heart. It was here that the day-to-day life of Athens took place. Artisans and lawyers, shopkeepers and philosophers, men from all walks of life rubbed shoulders here, creating the buzz and bustle of the most democratic city in Greece. Official posts were open to everyone, irrespective of their wealth and status, and you were expected to pull your weight and participate. On days when speeches and debates were heard, all the exits to the Agora were closed, apart from the one that led up to the Pnyx, where the Athenian assembly sat. Slaves with ropes dipped in red paint would chivvy citizens up the slope, marking out for a fine any who dragged their feet or tried to slip away. In Athens, democracy was enforced as rigorously as military discipline was in Sparta. It was a highly charged affair. Athens had gone democracy mad, and this was a dangerous time to stand out from the crowd. These pottery shards represent Athenian democracy at its most extreme.
They're called ostraka, and they worked as a kind of public referendum. If you thought anyone deserved to be exiled from the city for 10 years, you'd scratch or paint his name on the surface. In theory, they were used to stop ambitious individuals manipulating their popularity to gain too much personal power. But in practice, they were the perfect way to settle old scores. Just imagine the situation. You've got a grievance against a rival, you persuade a number of your friends to write his name down, and hey presto, for the next decade, he's history.
These ostraka gave us our word ostracism. What the practice created was a tall poppy's syndrome with a vengeance. It meant that many of the men responsible for Athens' wealth and security ended up as exiles, a long way from home. But it wasn't just the political life of Athens that got a shot in the arm. Everything from commerce to culture was infused with energy and new thinking.
Unlike Sparta, happily landlocked in the Peloponnese, Athens had always been half in love with the sea. With the defeat of the Persians, that love affair was formalised when the city was physically linked to the port of Piraeus by defensive walls. The walls meant that Athens was now officially a sea power, with all that implied in terms of trade, the movement of people in and out, and the potential for empire building.
The Athenians devoured their own city to build their walls, scavenging raw material from public monuments, even using headstones from graveyards. The result was 12 miles of imposing fortifications erected in record time. As a statement of intent, it certainly packed a punch. A defensive shield designed to keep the wealth of Athens in and unwanted busybodies from neighbouring states out. When the Spartans discovered its allies had been building walls, they weren't pleased. The Spartans disliked walls because walls defined cities, and cities, if you weren't careful, encouraged other things, like democracy. And if there was one thing Sparta distrusted more than walls, it was democracy. Sparta famously had no walls. It was said its walls were its young men, and its borders the tips of their spears.
It didn't make a big thing out of public buildings. It had them, but it didn't fetishise them as the Athenians did. One commentator noted that even at the height of its power, it resembled little more than a collection of small villages with surprisingly little monumental architecture. Nor did it have much time for laws, at least not the kind that could be written down and argued over by lawyers. For the Spartans, it wasn't laws or walls or magnificent public buildings that made a city. It was their own ideals. In essence, Sparta was a city of the head and the heart, and it existed in its purest form in the disciplined march of a hoplite phalanx on their way to war.
Sparta had no real concept of the dynamic forces that had been unleashed in Athens. And so while it carried on as it always had done, looking inward, striving for military perfection, the field was left open for Athens, this confident, outgoing democracy, to show what it could do. Ever since the defeat of Persia, the other Greeks had been looking for a leader to carry on the fight against the common enemy. Sparta allowed Athens to take on the role, which it did with relish. It invested heavily in sea power and became the policeman of the Eastern Mediterranean. Its allies were expected to toe the line and foot the bill, and if anyone objected, they'd soon find an Athenian fleet in their harbour. It was trireme diplomacy. Athens and Sparta represented two radically different ways of being. Choosing between them would seem to present no difficulties. Sparta was militaristic and xenophobic. Athens was dynamic and open to the world.
But of course, things are never that simple. Athens could be imperialist, arrogant and aggressive, and its democracy excluded women, foreigners and slaves. But for the Greeks, their main problem with Athenian politics was its volatility and the threat that posed to their cherished value of eunomia, or good order.
Pindar, the 5th century poet, called eunomia the secure foundation stone of cities. And the Greeks knew from bitter experience what happened when this foundation was threatened. Fields left unharvested, blood in the streets, civil war.
The Spartan system, on the other hand, with its peculiar blend of equality and elitism, held many attractions for the Greeks. Its emphasis on the common good, duty and cohesion seemed to guarantee good order.
But there were some aspects of Spartan society that the Greeks found less than admirable. Hundreds of years before, the Spartans had enslaved their immediate neighbours in Laconia, and then did the same to the Messenians, setting their citizens to work in the fields. These slaves, the Helots, were fellow Greeks. It was perfectly acceptable for Greeks to have barbarians as slaves, but to subjugate fellow countrymen was an affront to the cherished ideal that to be Greek was to be free. But what the Greeks found most incomprehensible about Sparta was its attitude to sexual politics. Because when it came to women, conservative Sparta was positively radical. If you were a woman, life in 5th century Athens probably wasn't a lot of fun. The city may have been at the cutting edge of all that was good in art, architecture and democracy, but these were strictly for the consumption of men. In public and in private, the sexes were segregated. In fact, in most of ancient Greece, women were expected to be neither seen nor heard.
The historian Xenophon recommended that they stay indoors, and for the orator Pericles, it was shameful if they were even mentioned in public.
Women, great will be your glory in not falling short of your natural character, and greatest will be hers who is least talked of among the men.
Athenian women led a very sheltered existence. Apart from training for domestic duties, they were given as little education as possible. In a society where women had no say, education must have seemed at best pointless, and at worst, dangerous. As one comic poet put it,
Teach women letters? A serious mistake. Like giving extra venom to a terrifying snake.
Some Athenians could recognise that there would be benefits in allowing a certain degree of literacy for women. Household management would be made easier for a start. If the lady of the house could keep accurate records, then men would be able to check up on how the housekeeping money was being spent. But that was about as far as support for education went. One Athenian summed up the general feeling when he wrote that further refinement makes women too lazy in other spheres, turning them into chatterboxes and busybodies.
perhaps to prevent this, an Athenian girl could be married off as young as 12 to a man chosen for her. She'd be taken away from her family and would disappear into her husband's house. A woman's role was to manage the family and do the chores, grind corn, wash or bake bread. Rich women who had slaves to take care of the drudgery would spin and sew. There would be the occasional sortie outside, to attend to domestic matters or go to a religious ceremony, but basically life was confined within 4 walls.
In Sparta, by contrast, women were everywhere. Imagine airlifting all the men between the ages of 7 and 60 out of this street, and you get a feeling of what it must have been like. For a start, there were more girls than boys, because they weren't victims of a state programme of infanticide. And if men weren't away fighting or training, they were relaxing with their male colleagues in the common messes. Women would have dominated the day-to-day life of the city.
The simple visibility of Spartan women made them objects of fear and fascination to non-Spartan men. Homer called Sparta Kaliganeka, the land of beautiful women. The beauty of Helen of Troy, originally Helen of Sparta, was legendary.
Of course, not every Spartan woman who looked at herself in a mirror like this could have lived up to her standards. But they were uniquely fit. Spartan girls had an upbringing unparalleled anywhere else in Greece. For starters, they were fed the same rations as boys and allowed to drink wine. The state taught them how to sing and dance, to wrestle, to throw the javelin and discus. And they were encouraged to be every bit as competitive as the boys.
Girls and boys would exercise naked, but there was nothing immodest about it. Nudity was the norm, because it was thought to banish prudery and encourage fitness. It paid off. Physically, they were outstanding.
There's a great scene in the comedy Lysistrata by the Athenian playwright Aristophanes. A group of Athenian women crowd round a Spartan woman called Lampito. What a gorgeous creature, they say. What healthy skin, what firmness of physique. And one of them adds, I've never seen a pair of breasts like that. To which Lampito proudly responds, I go to the gym, I make my buttocks hard.
When you see these lead votive offerings of dancers here in the Sparta Museum, you can understand why Spartan women were sometimes the subject of such lurid speculation amongst Athenian men.
One of the most important virtues for Athenian women was sophrosine, wise restraint. Well, there's not much of that in evidence here in these uninhibited dancers. Even after thousands of years, you can sense the energy and almost smell the sweat. Spartan dances were famous for their vitality. In one particularly athletic version, women had to jump up and drum their buttocks with their heels as many times as possible. It's incredibly difficult, but most importantly for the ancients, it revealed a large amount of naked thigh, which is probably where Spartan girls earned their nickname, thigh flashers. As part of their state education, the thigh flashers would come down here to the banks of the Eurotas in what one poet described as the Nicta di Ambrosias, the ambrosial night. There were ritual ecstatic dances and choral contests. The girls would sing to each other of limb-loosening desire, tossing their thick blonde hair, being ridden like horses and exhausted by love. It's no surprise that Sparta was one of the few ancient cities that had the reputation for encouraging girl-on-girl sex.
Women and men in Sparta were used to living separate lives. At the age of 7, boys would be sent away to the agoge, the tough, uncompromising Spartan system where they'd be schooled in the art of war. Male bonding wasn't just encouraged, it was compulsory. At the age of 12, a boy was paired with an older man, usually one of the unmarried warriors, aged between 20 and 30. This man would have been responsible not only for the conduct of the boy, but also for providing for him materially. He was a surrogate mother and father, as well as a teacher and mentor. But he was also a lover, for institutionalized pederasty was a part and parcel of life for the Spartan warriors. These intimate relationships seem to have had lasting psychological and emotional effects on the men. When the time came for them to get married, it must have been a difficult adjustment to make. But the pragmatic Spartans came up with an unusual way to help them through their wedding night. The Spartans practiced a custom called marriage by capture. On her wedding night, a bride would have her head shaved, like a small boy in the agoge. She'd be dressed in a man's cloak and sandals and left alone in a dark room. Meanwhile, her husband would quietly leave the common mess, come to her, lay her down on a straw pallet, have sex with her, and then slip back to sleep with his comrades as usual. This wasn't just a quaint wedding night ritual. It could carry on for months or even years. There's much debate about the significance of this bizarre ritual, but it seems obvious that it was a piece of sexual theatre designed to acclimatise men to the presence of women, when, up until then, their only experience of sex had been with other men. And yet, however hard the Spartans tried to make marriage more palatable for their young men, persuading them to do their duty could be problematic. According to one story, which is probably exaggerated but too good not to repeat, Spartan women would beat men about the head and then drag them around an altar to get them to commit. There's another more credible account that goes a bit like this. Unmarried men were stripped naked and forced to march around the marketplace in the middle of winter, singing a humiliating song about how their punishment was just and fair because they'd flouted the laws. Sparta was no place for a confirmed bachelor. The treatment meted out to these men may seem extreme, but its severity stemmed from a very real need to produce the next generation of warriors. The obsession with competition and physical fitness for girls reflected the same anxiety. Women were well fed and well treated, because healthy women were more likely to produce healthy babies. This is probably a fragment of a sculpture of Aletheia, the goddess of childbirth. What's certain is that she's in labour. There are spirits either side of her, clutching her belly, helping her get through those terrible pains. Spartan women would have paid this image a lot of respect because of the constant pressure on them to keep producing sturdy male children. It was a huge priority for the Spartans to keep the numbers of their warrior elite high. There were never that many of them, at most 10,000, a number which steadily declined throughout the 5th century. One reason was that Spartan girls didn't get married until they were 18, and boys until they were 28 or 29, incredibly late by Greek standards. But Spartan women weren't just baby makers. At a time when Greek women were expected to be invisible, they had power and responsibility in their own right. In fact, they were so cocksure, they dared to take on the men in politics, on the streets, and even in that most sacred bastion, the sporting arena. It wasn't just Spartan women's physicality that shocked the outside world. Their freedom was equally notorious. Aristotle described the place as a gynokratia, a state run by women, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. In Athens and other Greek cities, women were not allowed to own land or to control large amounts of wealth. Heiresses and widows married according to the wishes of father or brothers, usually to cousins or uncles, in order to keep the wealth in the family. And with the exception of travelling in ox-drawn carts to weddings and funerals, riding would have been out of the question. But in Sparta, women had the keys to the coffers. They could be landowners and property holders in their own right. They could inherit estates and even seem to have had the right to choose who or even whether to marry.
So you have to imagine these economically independent women riding out to oversee their estates and slaves, cracking the whip, running things. Unless you believe the myth of the Amazons, this was a sight unprecedented anywhere else in the ancient world.
Whereas laws in Athens were drawn up that restricted women's visibility in public, some Spartan women actually achieved the unthinkable. They became celebrities. The most famous example was Kyniska, a Spartan princess and, in her day, a sporting legend.
Kyniska means little hound, and she was obviously a tomboy from a sporty family. The names of her female relations translate as things like well-horsed, flash of lightning, she who leads from the front. But it would be Kyniska who'd go down in the history books as the owner of a champion chariot team.
Kyniska was an equestrian expert and very wealthy, the perfect qualifications for a successful trainer. She didn't race herself, but employed men to drive, and she made no secret of her ambition.
She entered her team at the Olympic Games, the showcase for outstanding athletes from all over the Greek world. It won. The men were astounded. 4 years later, she entered again. She won again. The bitter irony is that Kyniska probably didn't see her victories. At Olympia, the usual all-male rules applied. But she made certain that the world wouldn't miss out on her success. She dedicated a monument to herself right in the heart of the Olympic sanctuary. The inscription read, "I, Kyniska, victorious with a chariot of swift-footed horses, have erected this statue, and declare I am the only woman in all of Greece to have won this crown."
But women weren't only powerful in the sporting arena. Spartan women also played a role in the political life of the city. They were trained to speak in public, and although they had no official place in the decision-making process, they made sure their opinions were heard. And it was the women who seemed to have been the most vociferous when it came to enforcing the warrior ethic. Sparta's unwritten laws were policed at street level by a kind of community-based rough justice. Women were in the forefront, praising the brave and insulting cowards as they passed.
You get an idea of the kind of things they'd have called out from a collection called The Sayings of the Spartan Women. In Athens, silence was a mark of breeding. But Spartan girls were positively lippy. They were masters in the art of laconic speaking, named after Laconia, the heartland of Sparta. Deployed properly, a laconic phrase could draw blood from the skin of even the most armour-plated warrior.
When a warrior was describing the brave death of his comrade, a woman said,
"Such a noble journey. Shouldn't you have gone too?"
A man complained that his sword was too short. His mother replied,
"Take a step forward, and it would be long enough."
Though Spartan women enjoyed freedom of speech and financial liberty, it would be a mistake to paint a picture of Sparta as a kind of feminist wonderland.
You should think of Spartan women as regimental wives, the backbone of the system, breeding sons and then surrendering them to the agoge when they turn 7. Because Sparta was constantly anxious about its decline in birth rate, every Spartan boy must have been the apple of his mother's eye. Helots were there to do the domestic chores, and there was plenty of time to dote on little Leonidas. But when the time came to send him off to ski, though it must have been a wrench, it was done without hesitation. This was Sparta, and maternal instincts came a poor second to the interests of the state.
Our concept of motherhood is of a tender, supportive relationship between mother and child. But in Sparta, there was little room for sentimentality. In a state where unswerving obedience to the warrior code was rated more highly than life itself, mothers wanted to make absolutely sure that sons did their duty. Their approach was more Nazi than nurture. When a son left for battle, his mother would issue a traditional farewell. With your shield, or on it. In other words, either come back victorious, or come back dead.
But if a son failed to live up to this injunction, he could expect little sympathy from Mum. One story goes that a mother, confronting her runaway son, hitched up her skirts and asked him if he intended to crawl back where he'd come from.
Fighting wars must have seemed the soft option compared to incurring the wrath of mother. These women were anything but forgiving.
Why are you Spartans the only women who can rule men, someone once asked? Because we are the only ones who give birth to men.
The preservation of the Spartan utopia and its reputation as a warrior society depended on Spartan women producing male children and then willingly sacrificing them for the common good. It's an idea that's been picked up by more recent societies. In the early years of the Republic, American women were urged to model themselves on Spartan mothers. The future of the fledgling nation, they were told, would be shaped by a new generation of public-spirited citizen women, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for America.
It was an idea with lasting resonance. During the American Civil War, one mother addressed her son in an open letter to a newspaper.
I am ready to offer you up in defense of your country's rights and honor, and I now offer you, a beardless boy of 17 summers, not with grief, but thanking God that I have a son to offer.
Just as in Sparta, it was America's women who enforced the warrior ethic at street level. The women would leave bonnets and hoop skirts on the doorsteps of the unenlisted men, with letters telling them to join up.
The letters told the men either to come home wearing laurel crowns of victory or carried on shields of honour. The authors might not have realised it, but they were echoing the sentiments of Spartan mothers thousands of years before.
Spartan mothers' confidence in their sons' manliness was born of an ethos of heroism that stretched back over centuries. But since the Persian invasion, there'd been few opportunities for Spartan men to make their mothers proud. That would soon change. A huge conflict was about to erupt that would give the new generation of Spartan fighters a chance to test their courage. Since the Persian invasion, Sparta and Athens had coexisted peacefully. Against all the odds, the alliance had held firm. But given the huge ideological differences between these two Greek superpowers, it was almost inevitable that at some point mutual mistrust would boil over into outright conflict. In the end, it took one catastrophic event to shake the foundations of the alliance and set Sparta and Athens on a collision course. In the year 465 BC, a series of massive earthquakes hit Sparta. The consequences were devastating. The loss of life was immense. But the earthquakes also gave a golden opportunity to Sparta's enemy within. The huge population of helots, whose slave labour propped up the Spartan system. In the aftermath of the earthquakes, the helots seized their chance and revolted. The rebel slaves came here to Mount Ithome, at the heart of Mycenae, the homeland that had been taken from them by the Spartans. They fortified the position and waited for the Spartans to come. For all its fearsome reputation, Sparta failed to put down the revolt. And with the conflict dragging on, it was forced to appeal to Athens and its other allies for assistance.
Spartan allies sent over troops to help put down the revolt, and the Athenians brought in siege equipment, technology not developed by the hidebound Spartans. It was then that the Spartans began to fret. Enslavement of the Mycenaeans had always been a slightly sticky issue. As a whole, the Greeks had absolutely no problem with slavery. But when it came to subjugating an entire native Greek population, it was less easy to swallow. The Spartans knew this, and that's when paranoia set in. What would happen if the Athenians sided with the rebels, or even worse, spread the virus of democracy among Spartan citizens themselves? It was a risk not worth taking, and they sent the Athenians home.
Athens took serious offence at its dismissal by the Spartans. Being summarily sent home with no explanation was not the treatment they'd expected from an ally they'd only been trying to help. The Athenians tore up the old Treaty of Allegiance and began to collude with Sparta's enemies. And to add insult to injury, they even helped the rebels who'd managed to escape by setting them up in a new city. It was the beginning of open hostilities. Now it was only a matter of time before Sparta and Athens would be at war again. This time, with each other. When the war between Sparta and Athens finally came, it had many apparent causes. But the simple truth was that over a period of 50 years, Sparta had allowed Athens to get so powerful that its own sphere of influence on the mainland of the Peloponnese was now under threat. Seizing upon a rather flimsy pretext, Sparta declared war in 431 BC. It sent troops to invade Athenian territory. They forced their way to within 7 miles of the hated city walls of Athens itself. The one-time allies were now mortal enemies. The Athenian casualties of the first year of the war were given a ceremonial burial in this graveyard outside the city. Here, in their honour, Pericles delivered an impassioned speech to the crowd.
Pericles' funeral oration has gone down in history as one of the all-time great war speeches. It's based on a simple and satisfying proposition. Everything that we, the Athenians, do is right, and everything our enemies, the Spartans, do is wrong.
The Spartans, from their earliest boyhood, are submitted to the most laborious training and courage. We pass our lives without all these restrictions, and yet are just as ready to face the same dangers as they are. We meet danger voluntarily, with natural rather than with state-induced courage.
Pericles' speech is a rallying cry in defence of a way of being, a call to arms against an enemy whose social systems, politics, and even character were so alien as to make peaceful coexistence impossible.